The wind came first, a low whisper across the sun-baked flatlands, carrying the grit of a world worn down to its bones. Then the dust rose. It was not the pale dust of tired fields, but a deep, angry red, the color of rust and old blood, churned into the air by the iron-shod wheels of a freight wagon. It billowed in a great cloud, swallowing the hard blue sky and painting the landscape in a monochrome of ochre. Claire Beaumont pulled the linen scarf higher over her nose and mouth, tasting the earth on her tongue. She squinted, her eyes watering against the onslaught, and braced the heavy wooden box camera resting on its tripod. The legs of the tripod sank slightly into the soft shoulder of the road, and she adjusted them with a practiced hand, her focus unwavering. Behind her, the collection of raw timber and adobe buildings that constituted San Miguel shimmered in the heat, a fragile outpost clinging to the edge of the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory. It was the year 1879, and progress was arriving like the freight wagon, loud and shrouded in a cloud of its own making. The shutter clicked, a sound like a dry twig snapping, capturing the moment on a fragile glass plate. Light and chemistry, she thought, the only things you could truly trust to tell a story without exaggeration. She was here to document this place for a gazette back east, to capture the truth of the West before it was entirely paved over by railroad ties and ambition. A widow at 24, she had come west not to be remade, but to find a piece of the world that was still being made, a place where her own life, broken and reset, might not seem so out of place. Her temporary position as the town's schoolteacher provided a small income and a purpose beyond the lens, grounding her in the daily rhythms of this fledgling community. As the wagon rumbled past, the driver a silhouette against the hazy sun, she saw them. On a low ridge overlooking the valley, a group of riders sat motionless on their horses. They were too far to make out details, but their stillness was profound, a part of the landscape itself. Dine, the Navajo people. One rider was set slightly apart from the others, his posture radiating a quiet authority. Claire raised a hand to shield her eyes, her photographer's instinct flaring. She wanted to capture that image, the contrast of their silent watchfulness against the noisy intrusion of the wagon road. But they were too distant, and the dust was too thick. By the time she could even think of repositioning her cumbersome equipment, they had turned and melted back into the canyons from which they came, leaving only the heat and the settling red dust behind. Ashkenaz watched the freight wagon until it was a mere speck moving toward the cluster of buildings the white men called San Miguel. His hand rested on the smooth, cool stone of the turquoise amulet that hung from a leather cord around his neck. It was a piece of the sky, his grandfather had told him, a reminder that the Hozo, the balance of all things, was beautiful but easily disturbed. The wagon, the half-built railroad tracks that scarred the valley floor, the noise and the smoke from the new silver mine, they were all disturbances. His companions, two younger men from his clan, shifted in their saddles, their expressions mirroring his own quiet disapproval. They were looking for 3 horses that had strayed from the herd, a simple task that had brought them within sight of the white man's road. "The tracks are fresh," one of the young men said in their native tongue. "They went this way, toward the crooked river." Ashki nodded, his gaze sweeping over the familiar terrain. He knew this land not as a map of lines and borders, but as a living tapestry of stories, of sacred places, of seasons. He could read the story of a broken branch, of displaced stones, of the way the wind bent the sparse grass. His eyes, accustomed to the sharp light and vast distances, caught another set of tracks near the base of the ridge, away from the path the horses had taken. These were not the unshod prints of stray ponies. They were boot prints, heavy, worn by a man of considerable weight. They led toward the new mine, the one a powerful man named Ketchum was digging into the foothills of Tsibitai, the rock with wings, a place sacred to his people. "We will find the horses," Ashki said, his voice low and even. "Then we will return home." He did not speak of the boot prints. Some truths were best observed in silence. their meaning allowed to reveal itself in its own time. He nudged his horse forward, his back straight, a disciplined and watchful guardian in a land that was changing too fast. Later that day, the red dust had settled into a fine film covering every surface in San Miguel. It coated the wooden planks of the saloon porch, dulled the glass of the general store window, and crept through the cracks in the walls of the small room Claire rented. She worked carefully in the dim light, her hands smelling of collodion and silver nitrate as she developed the day's glass plates. The image of the freight wagon emerged slowly from the chemical bath, a ghost solidifying into a memory. It was a good shot, capturing the grit and motion of the moment. Her work done, she walked through the town as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows. San Miguel was a town of transients and hopefuls, miners with silver fever in their eyes, their faces etched with grime and exhaustion, cattlemen with wide-brimmed hats and a swagger that barely concealed their own weariness, railroad workers, a mix of Irish and Chinese laborers who kept to themselves, their labor the engine of the town's existence. It was a place simmering with unspoken tensions, a dry powder keg of cultural misunderstandings and competing desires. She saw Sheriff Tom Calder standing on the porch of his office, a man whose face seemed carved from the same weary rock as the surrounding canyons. He was old enough to remember a time before the railroad, before the mine, and he carried the weight of that memory in the slump of his shoulders. He nodded to her, a gesture of respect. "A dusty one today, Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It certainly is, Sheriff," Claire replied. She liked Calder. He was a man of few words, but his eyes held a deep current of weary integrity. He seemed to be one of the few people who understood that the law and justice were not always the same thing. Inside the saloon, she could hear the boisterous laughter and the tinny plink of an untuned piano. Through the swinging doors, she glimpsed Nathan Ketchum, the man who ran the mine and, by extension, the town. He was a handsome man in a tailored coat, his face flushed with whiskey and confidence. He was holding court, his voice easily carrying over the din. He was a man accustomed to being listened to. Standing near him, ever watchful, was Deputy Hale, a young man whose ambition was as plain to see as the shiny badge on his chest. Hale looked at Ketchum with an admiration that bordered on worship, eager to be on the right side of power. "The railroad needs this land cleared," she heard Ketchum declare to the men around him. "Progress has no time for superstition. There is silver in those hills, enough to make every man here rich. We will not be stopped by a few stray savages and their ghost stories." A cheer went up from the men at the bar. Claire felt a chill despite the evening heat. Ketchum's words were the sparks, and the town's prejudice was the powder. She continued her walk, her steps leading her to the small, one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. A few of her students were playing in the yard, their laughter a welcome sound. One of them, a small girl named Lena with bright, curious eyes, ran up to her. "Miss Beaumont," Lena said, her face beaming. "Ada told me a story today. She said the mountains have spirits that watch over us." Claire smiled and knelt down, brushing a speck of red dust from the girl's cheek. Ada was Lena's grandmother, a dying elder who was respected by all who knew her, a living repository of her people's history and wisdom. "That is a beautiful story, Lena," Claire said. Lena's expression turned serious. "Some of the boys say bad things about your people," she whispered, directing the words to a point beyond Claire's shoulder, a place only she could see. "They say they are dangerous." Claire's smile faded. She looked at the innocent face before her and felt the weight of the town's simmering conflict. The dust was not just in the air, it was in people's minds, clouding their judgment, making them see only shadows and threats. "Not everyone who is different is dangerous," she said softly. "Sometimes you have to look for the truth yourself. Do not just believe the stories people tell you." Her own words echoed in her mind. It was why her camera was so important. It did not tell stories. It simply showed what was there. Light and shadow, form and substance, the truth unadorned. That evening, as a sliver of moon rose over the dark mesas. Ashki stood at the entrance to a narrow canyon. He and his companions had found the lost horses, their trail leading them close to the perimeter of Ketchum's mining operation. While the others guided the animals home, Ashki had lingered, drawn by a sense of unease. He walked the ground where he had seen the boot prints earlier. He followed them, his steps silent on the rocky soil. They led to a small, sheltered overhang not far from a newly dug shaft. There, the rumors he had heard in whispers from his people took on a chilling reality. The ground was littered with tracks. He had heard the white miners talking in town, complaining about strange animal tracks spooking their mules near the new dig site. But Ashki knew the tracks of every animal that walked this land. These were not the prints of coyote or mountain lion. They were the distinct, patterned impressions of hobnailed boots, the kind worn by Ketchum's security men, dozens of them. They had been congregating here, in secret. He looked toward the mine, then back toward the dark silhouette of Tsebitai, a sacred place where the spirits of his ancestors slept. The pieces began to form a picture in his mind, one as clear and disturbing as an image emerging in a photographer's chemical bath. The rumors were a lie, a seed of fear planted for a purpose. The disturbance was not coming from the wilderness. It was coming from the heart of the white man's progress. The air was still and quiet, but he could feel the tremor of an approaching storm, a conflict born of greed and deceit. The red dust had settled for the night, but he knew the wind would rise again. It always did. 2 days later, the sun beat down on the newly constructed wooden bridge that spanned the shallow, muddy trickle of the San Miguel River. It was a proud, raw thing, smelling of fresh sawn pine and creosote, a testament to the relentless push of the railroad. Claire had set up her camera on the riverbank, intending to capture the bridge as a symbol of connection, of progress taming the wild. The weekly mail and payroll wagon, carrying wages for the miners and railroad crews, was due to cross it soon. It would make a fine, dynamic photograph for the Gazette. A small family in a buckboard wagon had stopped to water their horse just upstream, the laughter of their young son skipping stones across the water a bright, cheerful sound in the oppressive heat. Claire adjusted her focus, framing the sturdy trestles of the bridge against the stark backdrop of the red rock canyons. The world seemed quiet, held in a state of sleepy afternoon peace. The peace shattered with the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed instantly by a volley. The sound was flat and ugly, echoing off the canyon walls. Splinters exploded from the bridge railings. The lead horse of the mail wagon screamed and reared, its eyes wide with terror. The driver slumped forward, a dark stain spreading across his back. From the rocks and scrub on the far side of the river, figures rose, their faces obscured by rough cloth, their bodies adorned with a crude imitation of Navajo war paint. Chaos erupted. The payroll guards returned fire, their pistol shots popping like firecrackers against the heavy boom of the rifles. The family in the buckboard screamed. The father frantically tried to turn his terrified horse around as his wife pulled their son down onto the floorboards. Claire's first instinct was to drop to the ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of gunpowder and the taste of fear. Bullets whizzed overhead, thudding into the riverbank near her tripod. Her mind raced, a torrent of pure animal panic warring with the ingrained habit of her profession. Document, record, tell the truth. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the lens cap. She ducked low behind the bulk of her camera, a ridiculously flimsy shield, and pulled the slide on the plate holder. She had one chance, one plate. She aimed the lens toward the source of the attack, a blur of motion and dust and muzzle flashes. Then she saw him, not among the attackers, but on the near side of the river, moving with a fluid grace that was the antithesis of the surrounding panic. It was Ashki Nez. He had emerged from a stand of cottonwoods, as if from the earth itself. He was not looking at the attackers, but at the family in the buckboard. The child, in a moment of terror, had scrambled out of the wagon and was now frozen in the open. halfway between the illusory safety of his parents and the river. Ashki moved without hesitation. He did not run in a straight line, but flowed across the terrain, using every rock and dip in the ground for cover. He reached the boy, scooped him up in one arm without breaking stride, and turned back toward the trees. A rifle shot kicked up dirt at his heels. For a heart-stopping second, Claire thought he had been hit, but he kept moving, a silent, determined wraith, and disappeared with the child into the shadows of the cottonwoods. The sight of his deliberate courage steadied her shaking hands. She took a breath, held it, and pressed the shutter. The click was lost in the cacophony of gunfire. At that exact moment, a stray bullet struck one of the tripod legs. The entire apparatus lurched violently, the camera tilting sideways before crashing to the ground. The heavy wooden box landed with a sickening crunch. The ambush was over as quickly as it had begun. The attackers melted back into the rocks, their objective achieved. The mail wagon was still, its driver and one guard lifeless. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the terrified sobs of the mother in the buckboard as she was reunited with her son, brought safely to her by Ashki, who then vanished as silently as he had appeared. Within minutes, a posse thundered down the road from San Miguel, led by Nathan Ketchum and Deputy Hale. They rode in like saviors, though the danger had already passed. Ketchum took in the scene with a grim, theatrical authority. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the bodies, the bullet-riddled wagon, the terrified survivors. It was the Navajo, he declared, his voice ringing with outrage and certainty. Savages! This is their work. They have been threatening the mine, and now this, an attack on federal mail, an act of war. He strode over to the mail wagon, his boots crunching on the gravel. He pointed toward the distant canyons. They will pay for this. I want every able-bodied man. We will hunt them down. The miners and railroad workers who had come with him murmured in agreement, their faces hardening with anger and fear. The seed of prejudice Ketchum had planted in the saloon had found fertile ground in the blood-soaked dirt by the river. Deputy Hale, his face pale but his eyes alight with a kind of grim excitement, was quick to support his patron. We will form a proper posse. Mr. Ketchum, under my authority, we will bring them to justice. Justice, Ketchum repeated, his lips curling into a semblance of a smile. He looked directly at the crowd of men gathering around him. There is a $500 bounty on the head of their leader, a warrior they call Ashki Nez. I want him brought in, dead or alive. A cheer went up, a raw, ugly sound of mob vengeance. Claire, who had managed to right her camera and assess the damage, felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. Ashki. They were blaming the man who had just saved a child's life. She had seen it. She had seen him. But as she looked at the angry faces around her, she knew her word would mean nothing against the tide of their fury. She was an outsider, a woman, and they had already decided on their truth. Sheriff Calder arrived a few minutes later, his horse moving at a slow, deliberate pace. He surveyed the scene, his old eyes missing nothing. He listened to Ketchum's pronouncements and the angry chatter of the men without a word, his expression unreadable. His gaze fell on Claire, who was cradling her damaged camera. You all right? Miss Beaumont, he asked, his voice a low counterpoint to the rising hysteria. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of helplessness. She had a voice, a profession dedicated to the truth. But in this moment, she was silenced by fear. To speak out against Ketchum here, now, would be professional suicide, if not worse. She was alone, and the power in this town was a monolith she could not hope to challenge. That evening, Claire worked in her small room, the shutters closed, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light. The body of her camera was cracked, but the inner mechanism, the precious lens and plate holder, seemed to have survived. It was the plate itself she worried about. She mixed her chemicals with trembling hands, the acrid smell filling the small space. She slid the glass plate into the developing bath and rocked the tray gently, her heart pounding in time with the gentle sloshing of the liquid. Slowly, an image began to appear. It was a chaotic mess, blurred and tilted from the moment the camera fell. The bridge was a dark slash across a hazy, overexposed sky. Figures were indistinct, smudges of light and shadow. Her heart sank. It was useless. A failed photograph, a record only of her own terror. She almost tossed it into the waste bucket. But then, as the image darkened and the details sharpened, she saw it, in the bottom corner of the plate, magnified and brought into focus by some trick of the falling lens, was the partial figure of one of the attackers. He was kneeling, raising his rifle. His face was covered by a dark bandana, and on that bandana, small but unmistakably clear, was an embroidered emblem, a crossed pickaxe and shovel, the symbol of the San Miguel Mining Company. Claire stared at the image, her breath catching in her throat. The world outside her window, with its angry shouts and calls for vengeance, faded away. In her hands, she held the truth. A fragile, fractured, accidental truth captured on a piece of glass, but the truth nonetheless. The attackers were not Navajo. They were Ketchum's own men. The entire ambush had been a lie, a staged atrocity designed to turn the town against the Dine and give Ketchum the excuse he needed to seize their land. A wave of cold fear washed over her, so intense it made her feel nauseous. This piece of glass was not just evidence. It was a death warrant. If Ketchum knew she had this, knew what she had seen. She thought of Ashki Nez, a fugitive with a price on his head for a crime he did not commit, for an act of heroism no one but her had witnessed. Her conscience and her fear waged a silent, vicious war in the lamplight. To stay silent was to be complicit in a monstrous lie, to let an innocent man be hunted, to betray the very core of her professional and personal integrity. But to speak out, to show this photograph to anyone, was to stand against Nathan Ketchum. It was to invite the wrath of a powerful, ruthless man and the fury of a town that had already tasted blood. The fragile glass plate in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, the weight of a choice that could save a man's life or end her own. The fire had been lit, and she was holding the proof of who the arsonist was. The town of San Miguel festered. Fear and rage were a sickness in the air, thicker than the ever-present dust. Ketchum's bounty had turned neighbors into speculators, and every shadow seemed to hold a man calculating the value of another's life. Claire remained in her room, the door barred, the cracked glass plate wrapped in black cloth and hidden at the bottom of her trunk. She had become a prisoner of the truth she held. Each time the saloon doors swung open, the angry voices of the newly formed posse spilled out, led by a swaggering Deputy Hale who seemed to grow in stature with every cheer his name received. The chaos reached a fever pitch in the afternoon. A mob, drunk on whiskey and righteousness, marched through the street, their faces contorted with a righteous fury. They carried ropes. Their target was the small, peaceful encampment of Dine families who sometimes traded on the edge of town. It was a show of force, an act of collective intimidation. From her window, Claire saw the terror that seized the town. People scrambled indoors, barring their doors against the ugliness they had helped create. She watched as her students, dismissed early, scattered like frightened quail. Then she saw Lena. The little girl stood frozen near the schoolhouse, her eyes wide with a terror that Claire recognized intimately. The mob was between Lena and the way to her grandmother's camp. She was cut off, alone. Without a second thought, Claire unbarred her door. She could not hide while a child was in danger. She slipped out, keeping to the alleyways, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She reached the schoolhouse and pulled a terrified, sobbing Lena into her arms. "It is all right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We will get you home." But home was on the other side of the mob. As she tried to lead the child away, down a back path toward the river, two men from the posse saw them, their eyes lit up with suspicion and opportunity. "That is the teacher," one of them slurred, pointing. "She talks to them savages. Maybe she knows where that warrior Nez is hiding." They started toward them, their intentions a palpable threat. Claire's blood ran cold. There was nowhere to run. She pulled Lena behind her, her mind blank with sheer panic. Suddenly, a voice, low and calm, cut through the air from the rocks above the riverbed. "Leave them be!" The men spun around. Ashki Nez stood on a rocky outcrop, not 20 yards away. He was not armed with a rifle, only a knife at his belt. But his presence was so commanding, so utterly still and certain, that the two men hesitated. He had been watching, observing the town's descent into madness from a safe distance. "It is him," the other man hissed. "It is Nez. Get the others." One of them turned and ran back toward the town, shouting for Hale. The other drew his pistol, but his hand was shaking. Ashki did not move. His dark eyes were fixed on Claire and the child. He knew in that instant that their fates had become entangled. The white man's justice would not distinguish between a warrior, a teacher who consorted with him, and a native child. To the mob, they were all the same. "Come," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "Now." He slid down the rocks with an unnerving silence and speed. He took Lena's hand, and the child, instead of crying, looked up at him with a strange, trusting quiet. He glanced at Claire. She saw in his eyes not a question, but an acceptance of a shared, terrible fate. Trust him, or face the mob. It was no choice at all. She nodded, and the three of them plunged into the maze of canyons and dry washes that bordered the town, just as the shouts of Deputy Hale and his posse rose behind them. The pursuit was immediate and relentless. From the high ridges, Claire could see the cloud of dust that marked the posse's progress. They were not trackers like Ashki, but they had numbers and a burning, righteous anger. Ashki led them on a punishing course, through narrow slots in the rock and over sun-blasted mesas, a landscape that was both his protector and their tormentor. Sheriff Calder watched them go from the edge of town. He had organized his own official posse, but he did so with a deliberate, leaden slowness. Deputy Hale, eager and flush with Ketchum's authority, had already charged ahead with the volunteers. "Spread out," Calder told his two remaining deputies, gesturing vaguely toward the vast, empty horizon. "Check the southern flats. No need to rush into those canyons. A man can get lost in there." His mind was not on the chase, but on a day 5 years past, a rockslide in the high country, his leg pinned, the taste of blood in his mouth. It was Ashki, out hunting, who had found him. The Navajo warrior had worked for hours with a quiet, tireless strength to free him, and then had carried him 10 miles to safety. Calder owed him his life. He could not now take Ashki's in return. He would follow the law, but he would follow it at his own pace, praying the canyons would do their work first. For Claire, the world shrank to the burning sun above, the searing rock below, and the steady, retreating back of the man in front of her. The heat was a physical presence, stealing the breath from her lungs and the moisture from her body. Her fine leather shoes, suitable for a schoolhouse, were shredded by the sharp rock. Her lips cracked, and a dull, throbbing headache settled behind her eyes. Lena, though frightened, was stoic, her small hand held firmly in Ashki's. By the second day, their water was gone. Despair, a cold and heavy thing, began to settle in Claire's heart. She stumbled, her vision blurring. Ashki stopped and looked back, his face a mask of grim determination. He said nothing, but led them to a cluster of barrel cacti. With his knife, he methodically sliced off the top of one and began to mash the pulp inside into a wet slush. He scooped some out with his hand and gave it to Lena, then to Claire. The water was bitter and thick, but it was life. It was a miracle born of knowledge she could not comprehend. He watched her drink, his expression unreadable. "You are stronger than you look," he said. It was not a compliment, but a simple statement of fact. That night, they huddled in a shallow cave, the temperature dropping with a shocking suddenness. The desert that baked them by day now sought to freeze them by night. The stars came out, a brilliant, cold spray of diamonds against a black velvet sky. They seemed close enough to touch. "How do you know the way?" Claire asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Everything looks the same." Ashki pointed a long finger toward the sky. "That is the one we call the first woman. It always stays in its place, He pointed to another cluster. That is the rabbit tracker. He shows the path of the hunter. The stories are our maps. The sky does not lie. He spoke of the stars not as distant balls of fire, but as living characters in an eternal story. Claire, who had always seen the world through the rational, scientific frame of her camera lens, felt a sense of wonder. She was learning a new way of seeing, of understanding her place in the vastness. Ashki showed her how to tie a taut line hitch, a simple knot that could secure a shelter or a pack, its interlocking loops a small piece of practical magic in the shared, desperate work of survival. The walls of suspicion between them began to crumble. They were no longer a white woman and a Navajo warrior. They were two people trying to keep a child alive. On the third day, the posse drew close. They heard the clatter of shod hooves on rock and the distant shouts of men. Ashki hurried them behind a jumble of massive boulders, pulling them into a deep crevice. He put a finger to his lips, his body tense. They held their breath as the riders passed by, so close that Claire could hear the creak of their saddle leather and the low curse of a frustrated man. Deputy Hale was in the lead, his face red with sun and anger. He reined in his horse just beyond their hiding place. "We lost the tracks again." He spat. "It is like they disappeared into thin air." One of the men with him, a miner Claire recognized from the saloon, pointed. "There. Wild cattle tracks. Maybe they went that way, trying to cover their trail." Hale grunted. "Fine. We will follow them for a mile, but he is out here, and he is running out of land." As Hale wheeled his horse around, something small and brassy fell from his belt, landing silently in the thick dust. It was a spent rifle cartridge. The posse rode on, their voices fading into the oppressive silence. They waited for a long time after the sound was gone. When Ashki was certain they were alone, he slipped out of the crevice. His eyes scanned the ground, missing nothing. He walked to the spot where Hale had stopped and bent down. Picking up the cartridge, he turned it over in his fingers. His brow furrowed. It was heavier than it should be. He worked at the primer end with the tip of his knife. It was not a spent round. It was a container. A tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper was tucked inside. He carefully extracted it and unrolled it. Claire watched. Her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" He handed it to her. The paper was a page torn from a ledger, covered in a tight, spidery script. It was a list of dates, times, and cargo designations, next to a date 3 days from now. A single line was circled midnight train, eastbound, payroll car, ML, secured. "No," Claire murmured, her mind racing. "The mine ledgers, Ketchum's books, they are moving the evidence." Ashki looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond stoicism and resolve. It was a glimmer of hope, sharp and dangerous. They were being hunted. But the hunter had grown careless. He had dropped a map that did not show the way through the canyons, but the way through Ketchum's lies. They had been running for their lives. But now, for the first time, they had a reason to run towards something. The first piece of a weapon had just fallen into their hands. The final leg of their journey was a descent into a deep, hidden canyon, a crack in the earth concealed by a series of overlapping rock formations. The walls of the canyon were a deep, cool red, and a trickle of clear water, no wider than a man's hand, ran along its floor, nourishing a thin ribbon of green. To Claire, who had seen nothing but sun-bleached rock and thorny scrub for 3 days, it looked like paradise. The camp was not large. A collection of hogans, solid structures of earth and wood, nestled under the protective overhang of the canyon wall. Smoke rose from a central fire, carrying the scent of juniper and roasting corn. As they entered the small settlement, people emerged from their homes, their faces solemn and questioning. There was no alarm, only a deep, watchful quiet. An old woman with a face like a beautiful, intricate map of time stepped forward. It was Ada. She went first to Lena, her hands gnarled but gentle, cupping the child's face. She spoke in the soft, flowing cadences of the Dine language, her voice a soothing balm. Lena, who had been a model of silent endurance throughout the ordeal, finally broke. burying her face in her grandmother's skirts and sobbing with relief. Ada held her close for a moment before handing her off to a younger woman, her mother, who embraced her with a fierce, trembling love. Then Ada turned to Claire. Her dark, intelligent eyes took in everything at a glance: the shredded shoes, the sunburnt face, the exhaustion that was so profound it was a physical ache. She gestured for Claire to sit by the fire and then disappeared into a hogan, returning with a bowl of water and a clean cloth. She knelt and began to gently clean the cuts and blisters on Claire's feet. She did not speak English, and Claire did not speak Navajo, but no words were needed. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended language. Ashki stood nearby, speaking in low tones to the men who had gathered. He recounted the events in town, the ambush, the accusation. Claire could not understand the words, but she could read the expressions on the men's faces: grim acceptance, a familiar weariness, but no surprise. This was not a new story to them. Later, after Claire had eaten a simple meal of corn mush and goat cheese that tasted like the most exquisite feast she had ever known, she watched the life of the camp unfold. It was a life of quiet industry and deep-rooted discipline. Women ground corn on stone mitates, their movements rhythmic and ancient. A man sat in the shade, carefully mending a piece of tack. Children played, but their games were quiet, their laughter subdued. There was a profound sense of community, of each person knowing their role, their place in the delicate balance of their shared existence. As twilight painted the canyon walls in hues of purple and rose, Claire felt a stirring of her old self. She went to the battered remains of her equipment and retrieved her camera. She approached Adaya, who sat by the fire, her hands busy weaving a small basket. Claire held up the camera, then pointed to the old woman, and then to her own eye, a simple pantomime of her intention. She would not take this picture. She would ask for it. It was a sign of respect, a bridge she was trying to build. Ada looked at the wooden box, then at Claire. A long moment passed. The old woman's eyes seemed to look straight through Claire, weighing her, measuring her spirit. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Claire worked with a reverence she had never felt before. She set up the tripod on the packed earth, carefully composing the shot. The firelight flickered on Ada's weathered face, illuminating the wisdom and sorrow etched there. When she was ready, she did not simply take the picture. She waited until Ada looked up, her gaze meeting the lens directly. In that moment, Claire felt she was not just capturing an image, but being entrusted with a soul. The click of the shutter felt like a sacred pact. Afterward, as Claire packed away her equipment, Ada spoke to Ashki, her voice low but intense. She gestured toward the east, in the direction of the San Miguel mine. Even without understanding the language, Claire could feel the weight of her words. She spoke of the ground beneath the mine, of the ancestors who rested there, of a sacred trust that could not be broken. Ashki listened, his face carved from stone, his posture rigid with the burden of his grandmother's words. He was not just a fugitive fighting a false accusation. He was a guardian, and his duty was to this land, to these people, to the memory of those who came before. The night grew deep and cold. The stars were a brilliant fire in the sky, the same stars Ashki had taught her to read. He came and sat beside her at the edge of the fire's light. For a long time, he was silent, staring into the flames. "My grandmother says the silver Ketchum Seeks is in the heart of our most sacred ground," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "It is where we bury our dead. To disturb that ground is to unravel the world. I cannot let that happen." Claire looked at his proud, troubled profile. She saw the immense weight he carried: the safety of his people, the sanctity of his traditions, the lives of two strangers he had bound himself to protect. He reached up and took the turquoise amulet from his neck. The stone was smooth and cool, a small piece of fallen sky. "In our stories," he said, "turquoise is a protector. It is given to those who must walk a dangerous path." He held it out to her. She started to protest, to say that she could not possibly take something so precious. He pressed it into her hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. The touch was warm and firm. "Take it," he said, "so the trail can see you. It is alone." Her fingers closed around the stone. It felt warm, alive with a history she could only guess at. It was the most profound gesture of trust she had ever received. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the appearance of a camp sentry, who emerged from the darkness with another man, this one cloaked and hooded. The man's boots were the sturdy, practical footwear of a white man. As he stepped into the firelight and lowered his hood, Claire gasped. It was Sheriff Tom Calder. He looked weary, his face etched with lines of worry. He ignored Claire for the moment, his eyes fixed on Ashki. "I had to come," he said, his voice low and strained. "My deputies are good men, but Hale is listening to Ketchum, not to me. The posse is a mob. They are not looking for justice." Ashki simply watched him, his expression revealing nothing. "You know I owe you," Calder continued, his gaze unwavering. "You saved my life. I have not forgotten that. I have suspected Ketchum was a snake from the day he arrived. He has the whole town in his pocket, but he operates just inside the law. I have never had anything to hold against him. Until now." "Now," Claire said, finding her voice. "Now you do." She pulled the folded piece of ledger paper from her pocket and handed it to the sheriff. Calder squinted at it in the firelight, his lips moving as he read. "The midnight train," he murmured. He looked up, his eyes sharp. "You think this is his plan? To move his ledgers?" "He is cleaning his tracks," Claire said. Calder shook his head slowly, a grim look on his face. "He is smarter than that." He pulled a crumpled piece of yellow paper from his own coat pocket. It was a telegraph flimsy. "My man at the rail office. He is a good man. Owes me a favor. He said Ketchum's man booked a private car, a heavy one. He said it was for a special shipment of ore samples. He said it was for the train leaving tonight." Tonight, Claire felt a jolt of adrenaline. "But the note says 3 days from now." "The note is a lie," Calder said, his voice flat. "Or an old plan, a decoy in case someone got curious. If you found it, he wanted you running in the wrong direction. Chasing a ghost train 3 days from now. No. The real ledgers, the ones that can prove he hired those men for the ambush. They are leaving San Miguel in less than 6 hours." The three of them stood in a circle of firelight, surrounded by the immense, sleeping darkness of the canyon. The quiet sanctuary had suddenly become the staging ground for an impossible plan. The enemy was closer, and the clock was ticking faster than any of them had known. The unlikely alliance was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared, terrifying truth. They were out of time. There was no time for deliberation, no room for doubt. Calder's news had turned their world on its axis. The plan to intercept a train 3 days hence was a fool's errand. The real battle was here, and it was now. The mine office, a flimsy wooden shack clinging to the hillside above the main shaft, held the key. It was the heart of Ketchum's operation, and they had to cut it out before it was moved beyond their reach. Ashki led them, a ghost in the moonless dark. He moved not along paths but through the spaces between them, his feet finding silent purchase on rock and loose shale. Calder followed, his breathing heavy but his steps surprisingly sure for a man his age. He knew the layout of the mine's surface buildings, the patrol routes of the handful of guards Ketchum employed. Claire came last, her senses screaming with a mixture of terror and a strange, sharp focus. In one hand, she carried a small satchel containing her developing chemicals and a few fresh, unexposed glass plates. In the other, she clutched the precious, cloth-wrapped plate, the image of the attacker with the mining company logo. It was her only weapon, and it felt as fragile as a bird's egg. The mine was a scar on the land, a place of unnatural light and sound in the vast, sleeping darkness. Torches flickered on posts, casting long, dancing shadows. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel echoed from a distant smithy. 2 guards stood near the main entrance to the office, sharing a bottle and laughing at some crude joke. "There is a window at the back," Calder whispered, his voice a dry rasp. It overlooks the ravine, used for dumping slag. No one watches it. Ashki gave a single sharp nod. He held up a hand, signaling them to wait. And then he was gone, melting into the shadows at the base of the building. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs. She watched the two guards, praying they would not turn. An eternity passed in the space of a minute. Then, a dark shape appeared in the black square of the rear window. It was Ashki, beckoning them forward. Calder gave her a small push. "Go, I will keep watch." Getting through the window was a clumsy, graceless affair. Ashki reached down, his grip strong and sure on her arm, and pulled her up and over the sill. She landed inside with a soft thud, the air thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, ink, and damp earth. The office was a single, cluttered room. A large desk dominated the space, littered with maps and assay reports. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in one corner, and a gun rack on the wall held 3 gleaming rifles. A single lantern, turned down low, cast a weak, golden light over the chaos. Ashki moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood, listening. Claire went straight for the desk. Her hands skimmed over the papers, her eyes searching, shipping manifests, payroll receipts, supply orders, nothing. "A cabinet," she whispered, pointing to a heavy oak piece of furniture against the far wall. It was locked. Ashki was at her side in an instant. He did not waste time with the lock. He placed his hands on either side of the cabinet doors, braced his feet, and pulled. The wood groaned in protest, and then the lock splintered with a sharp crack. Inside were stacks of leather-bound ledgers. Claire pulled out the top one, her fingers fumbling with the cover. She flipped through the pages, her breath held tight in her chest. It was all there. Page after page of meticulous accounting, a testament to Ketchum's organized greed. And then she found it, a section at the back, under the heading Special Disbursements, Security. It was a list of names, men she recognized as Ketchum's most loyal thugs. Next to each name was a date, the date of the ambush at the bridge, and a payment amount far exceeding any reasonable wage. It was the proof, cold and irrefutable, written in the company's own ink. A floorboard creaked on the porch outside. Ashki's hand shot out, closing the ledger with a soft thud. He pushed her behind the desk just as the door swung open. Deputy Hale stood silhouetted against the torchlight, a lantern in one hand, his pistol in the other. 2 of Ketchum's guards flanked him, their rifles held at the ready. Hale's ambitious, youthful face was set in a hard, ugly expression. "I knew the old man had lost his nerve," Hale said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I figured he might come sniffing around. I did not expect him to bring you, Miss Beaumont." His eyes flickered to the splintered cabinet, then to the ledger on the desk. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Looking for something. Before Claire or Ashki could react, the back window darkened. Sheriff Calder heaved himself through, his own pistol drawn, his face a mask of grim fury. "It is over, Hale," Calder said, his voice a low growl. "You have made your choice. Now put the gun down." Hale laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Over it is just beginning. Sheriff, you are a relic. Your kind of law does not have a place in the future. Ketchum is building that future, and I am going to be a part of it." He gestured with his pistol toward the ledger. He cannot have any embarrassing paperwork holding him back. He nodded to one of his men. Burn it all." The guard grinned and kicked over the lantern he was carrying. Oil sloshed across the dry wooden floorboards and erupted in a whoosh of brilliant, hungry flame. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking up the walls, devouring the papers on the desk. Claire cried out and lunged for the ledger, but Ashki pulled her back. The heat was intense, a solid wall. Black, oily smoke began to fill the room, choking them, stinging their eyes. Calder fired a shot over Hale's head, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. "Get out!" he yelled at Ashki and Claire, gesturing toward the back window. "Go!" Hale returned fire, not at Calder, but at the wall near Claire. The bullet splintered the wood just inches from her head. In her panic, she stumbled backward, her hip striking the small table where she had placed her satchel. The box of glass plates tumbled to the floor, landing with the heartbreaking sound of shattering glass. All her work, all her hope, destroyed in an instant. There was no more time for thought. The smoke was a living, blinding thing, stealing the air from their lungs. Ashki grabbed the smoldering ledger from the edge of the burning desk, beating the flames out against his leather leggings. Then he seized Claire's arm, his grip like iron, and dragged her toward the window. Calder provided cover, exchanging shots with Hale and his men, who were now backing out the front door, their work of destruction complete. Ashki shoved Claire through the window and followed in a single, fluid motion. They landed on the loose rock of the ravine just as the roof of the office began to groan, threatening to collapse. The night air was a shock to their tortured lungs, but they were not safe. Figures were moving around the side of the building, trying to cut them off. "This way," Ashki choked out, pulling her along. The path he chose was not a path at all. It was a sheer rock face, a cliff that dropped into the pitch-black darkness of the ravine. Claire's heart seized. It was impossible. "I cannot," she gasped, pulling back. "You must." He did not give her time to argue. He slung the hot ledger over his shoulder on a leather thong, and then, with a strength that seemed inhuman, he lifted her into his arms. He carried her as if she weighed nothing. He moved along a tiny, crumbling ledge, his back pressed against the rock, the abyss yawning beneath them. Claire closed her eyes, burying her face in his shoulder, her mind refusing to comprehend the terrifying, vertical world they were traversing. She could hear shouts and the occasional gunshot from above, the sounds seeming to come from a different world. He did not stop until they reached a wide, stable outcrop of rock 100 yards away, concealed from the mine by a curtain of stone. He set her down gently. She collapsed onto the rock, her body trembling uncontrollably, her lungs heaving as she coughed up the last of the acrid smoke. They had escaped, but at what cost? The ledger was saved, its edges charred and blackened, but the pages inside hopefully intact. But her plates, her proof, were gone. The one piece of irrefutable, visual evidence was a pile of shattered glass in a burning shack. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was his word and a stolen, singed book against Ketchum's power and Hale's lies. They had lost. Ashki stood at the edge of the outcrop, a silhouette against the hellish orange glow of the fire, his body tense as he watched for any sign of pursuit. Claire, lost in her misery, mechanically reached into the deep pocket of her duster, a habit of checking on her most precious possession. Her fingers brushed against a small rectangular object wrapped in thick cloth. Her breath caught. In the frantic moments before the fire, she had separated the one important plate from the others. She had tucked it safely away, a subconscious act of preservation, an instinct to protect the one thing that mattered most. The rest had been fresh plates, blanks waiting for images they would never hold. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it, in the flickering, distant light of the fire. She unwrapped it. The glass was intact, cool, solid, and whole. "Ashki," she whispered, her voice cracking with a surge of renewed, defiant hope. He turned, his face unreadable in the shadows. "I have it," she said, holding up the plate like a shield. "I still have it." They were fugitives, hunted and alone. The entire territory was now their enemy, but in the darkness, high above the flames, they possessed the truth, a fragile, singed, and singular truth, and for now that was enough. They moved through the pre-dawn chill as phantoms, the orange glow of the burning mine office a fading, malevolent eye behind them. Every muscle in Claire's body was a screaming nerve, every breath a painful reminder of the smoke she had inhaled. Ashki moved with a grim, relentless purpose, the charred ledger slapping softly against his back, his eyes constantly scanning the dark ridgelines. The single glass plate, wrapped in its cloth, was a heavy, sacred weight in Claire's pocket. It was the only thing of value she had left in the world. He led her not back toward the sanctuary of his people's camp, which would surely be the first place Hale would look, but deeper into the wilderness, into a folded, broken landscape of black volcanic rock and twisted skeletal junipers. It was a place designed to discourage pursuit. Just before the sun crested the horizon, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, he stopped. They were at the edge of a small, sunken canyon, a pocket of stillness in the vast, hostile land. A thick mist rose from its floor, ghostly and silent in the half-light. With the mist came a faint, sulphurous smell and the gentle, rhythmic sound of bubbling water. He gestured for her to follow him down a steep, narrow trail. As they descended, the air grew warm and moist, a startling contrast to the crisp, dry air of the high desert. At the bottom lay a series of rock pools, their surfaces steaming, their water as black as obsidian under the dim sky, a natural hot spring, a secret breath from the warm heart of the earth. "You must wash," he said, his voice rough. "The smoke is on you. They can smell it." He spoke of tracking, of practical survival, but Claire heard a deeper meaning. They needed to wash away the taint of the fire, the violence, the suffocating proximity of their own deaths. She looked at the steaming water, then at her own filth-caked hands and smoke-stained clothes. She was exhausted to the very marrow of her bones, but the water was an irresistible invitation. He turned his back, giving her privacy without a word, and walked to the far end of the small canyon, his posture that of a sentinel. Claire stripped off her ruined clothes, her body shivering in the cool air before she stepped into the first pool. The heat was a shock, a liquid embrace that seemed to penetrate her very soul. She sank down until the water was up to her chin, the heat working its magic on her aching muscles, her raw throat, her frayed nerves. She washed the soot from her hair and skin, watching it swirl away into the dark water, a physical shedding of her terror. When she was done, she felt renewed, if not rested. She dressed again in her tattered clothes and found Ashki sitting on a flat rock, his eyes closed. He opened them as she approached. He looked as weary as she felt, the firelight they had escaped still reflected in the depths of his gaze. "I am afraid," she said, the admission a quiet surrender in the stillness of the canyon. The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the steamy air between them. He did not offer false comfort. He did not tell her everything would be all right. He simply nodded, accepting her fear as a tangible thing. "It is not just being caught," she continued. "The need to explain, to give voice to the true shape of her terror, overwhelming her. It is the lie. It feels so much bigger than the truth. Ketchum is building a world made of his lies, and everyone in San Miguel is living in it. Our truth is just this one little piece of glass." She touched the pocket of her duster. "What if it is too small to hold back the dark? What if it breaks? What if no one believes it? Then we die, and the lie becomes history. It will be like we never even existed." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for some kind of answer, some hope to cling to. He was silent for a long time, his gaze directed inward, to a place of old pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, laced with a sorrow that seemed ancient. "When I was a boy," he began, "younger than Lena, my older brother and I were tending our family's sheep in the hills to the north, a different part of our land. 3 white men came, prospectors. They said they had found a vein of silver. The vein was on a slope where we buried our grandfathers." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My brother told them they could not dig there. He explained that it was sacred ground. He did not threaten them. He spoke with respect, as he was taught. They laughed at him. They told him the ground belonged to the United States government now, and that the only thing sacred was the silver in it. My brother stood in their way. He would not move. Ashki's hands clenched into fists in his lap. He stared at the steam rising from the pools, but Claire knew he was seeing something else entirely. They had shovels. They did not even use their guns. He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so profound, that she felt her own breath catch. "They killed him for a piece of rock that held no value to us, except as a place of memory. They buried him under the rock they dug up, and they took their silver. No one was ever punished. Their story was that he attacked them, a wild savage. It was a lie. But it was their lie, and they were the only ones left to tell it. I have been fighting that lie my entire life. In that moment, Claire understood everything. She understood the quiet discipline, the deep-rooted watchfulness, the fierce, uncompromising guardianship of his land and his people. It was not an abstract principle. It was a wound that had never healed, a promise made to the memory of a dead brother. He was not just fighting for a piece of land. He was fighting for the truth of his brother's life, and his own. The steam swirled around them, creating a small, intimate world, shutting out the vast, dangerous wilderness. The fear of being consumed by Ketchum's lie was still there, but now it was shared. The burden was no longer hers alone. She reached out and placed her hand on his. His skin was calloused and warm. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, a quiet and solemn pact. "We will not let them bury the truth this time," she said, her voice firm. They sat in silence for a long time, their hands clasped, drawing strength from each other. The sun began to climb, and the first rays of light pierced the mist, striking the surface of the black water and making it glitter. A small moment of beauty, of peace, in a world that had offered them none. The constant tension that had held Claire's body rigid for days began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and trusting stillness. She felt a sudden, light-hearted impulse, a bubble of life rising through the layers of her fear and exhaustion. She pulled her hand free and, with a small splash, sent a spray of warm water toward him. It beaded on his leather vest. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a sight so rare and unexpected it made her heart ache. He retaliated, his splash larger, more deliberate, soaking the front of her dress. Soon they were both in the water, a quiet, playful battle in the rising steam. For a few precious moments, they were not fugitives. They were just a man and a woman, alive and together in a hidden, beautiful place, in a moment of shared laughter, a sound that felt like a miracle. She moved close to him, the water swirling around them. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. Naked and wild, she laughed, the words a soft whisper against his skin. The Navajo warrior's hands held her tight as if letting go would kill him. They stood there as the sun rose higher, the world outside their misty haven forgotten. In that embrace, there was a silent promise, a commitment forged not in words, but in shared pain and a desperate, clinging hope. Later, as they sat drying on the warm rocks, the real world began to intrude once more. The charred ledger and the wrapped glass plate lay between them, the symbols of their impossible task. "How can we make them see it?" Claire murmured, mostly to herself. "A crowd will not wait for me to pass around a small piece of glass. Hale and Ketchum will shout me down before the first man sees it." She watched as a brilliant shaft of morning light cut through the last of the steam, striking the far wall of the canyon. It was a perfect, sharp rectangle of pure, white light, and in that moment, an idea sparked in her mind, an idea born of her craft, her knowledge of light and lenses. "The sun," she whispered, her eyes wide with a dawning excitement. "The sun. It is the first and greatest lantern." Ashki looked at her, his expression questioning. "My camera is broken," she explained, her words coming faster now. "I cannot make prints, but I do not need to. All I need is the plate and a dark space and a single, strong source of light. I can project the image. We can turn a wall into a photograph. We can make the truth so big that no one can ignore it." A new kind of hope, not just for survival but for victory, began to dawn. They had a plan, a fragile, desperate, beautiful plan. They would use the light itself to fight the darkness. The plan, born of light and hope in the misty canyon, was contingent on one thing: getting back into San Miguel unseen. But the desert had other plans. For 2 days, they traveled a wide, circuitous route, living on what little Ashki could hunt and forage. A suffocating stillness had settled over the land. The air grew thick, heavy, and wet. a humid blanket that clung to the skin and made every breath a conscious effort. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, turned the color of a dull pewter bowl, and a strange, yellow light filtered down, draining the world of its color. They were making their way down a long, sloping wash toward the river, still miles from the town, when the first drop of rain fell. It was not a gentle drop, but a fat, heavy splat that left a dark circle in the dust the size of a silver dollar. Another followed, and then another. Within minutes, the sky opened. It was not a cleansing rain, but a violent, furious downpour, a deluge that turned the dry ground to slick, sucking mud. The wash, a safe, dry pathway moments before, became a death trap. A low rumble in the distance grew to a deafening roar, and a solid wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, came surging around the bend. "Up!" Ashki yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar. He grabbed Claire's arm and half dragged, half threw her up the steep, muddy bank. They scrambled on hands and knees, the mud giving way beneath them as the flash flood tore past. A monstrous, liquid beast devouring everything in its path. They reached the top, gasping and soaked, just as the crest of the flood wave passed, its power a terrifying thing to behold. The rain continued to fall in blinding sheets. The entire landscape was being reshaped, dissolved by the storm. "The town," Claire gasped, her mind reeling, the new settlement, the shacks by the river. Ashki was already looking in that direction, his face grim. "The river will be a monster. The levee they built, it is just piled earth. It will not hold." They had to go, not to enact their plan, but because a catastrophe was unfolding, and to be human was to run toward the sound of disaster, not away from it. By the time they reached the outskirts of San Miguel, the scene was one of biblical devastation. The San Miguel River had become a raging, brown torrent, 3 times its normal size, and it had breached its banks. The temporary levee, the one Ketchum had so proudly dedicated a month before, had crumbled, and a muddy tide was pouring into the lower section of the town. Shacks had been torn from their foundations and were bobbing like broken toys in the current. The screams of people, the terrified lowing of cattle, and the groaning of stressed wood all mingled with the ceaseless roar of the storm. The town's small wooden church stood on a slight rise, its steeple a beacon against the bruised sky. Claire's first and only thought was for her students. She turned to Ashki, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "The children, I have to get to the school." He met her gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. He understood. "Go, get them to the church. It is the highest ground." He squeezed her hand once, a brief, hard pressure, and then he was gone, moving toward the worst of the chaos, a place of swirling water and desperate cries for help. Claire ran, her feet sinking into the mud, her lungs burning. The schoolhouse was still standing, but water was lapping at the steps. She threw open the door. Inside, a handful of her students were huddled together, their faces pale with terror. Their parents, mostly minors and their wives who lived in the now flooded lower town, had been unable to reach them. "To the church!" she yelled, her voice a commanding crack that cut through their fear. "Everyone, hold hands! Do not let go!" She led the small, terrified chain of children out into the storm. The water was already knee-deep, the current deceptively strong. She moved slowly, deliberately, her heart in her throat with every step. She saw a miner she recognized, a man named Peters, clinging to the roof of his submerged porch, his wife and small baby beside him. He yelled something at her, but his words were snatched away by the wind. All she could see was the sheer terror in his eyes. They reached the church, a haven of solid wood and relative safety. She herded the children inside, their sobs echoing in the empty space. From the doorway, she could see the unfolding tragedy. The bell in the steeple above her began to ring, a frantic, clanging peal, as the town's few able-bodied men tried to organize a rescue. She saw Sheriff Calder, waist-deep in the muddy water, helping to pull a woman from a collapsed shed. His face was a mask of grim determination. He was no longer the hesitant, conflicted man she had known. He was simply a man doing what needed to be done. Then she saw Ashki again. He was a force of nature, as powerful and relentless as the flood itself. He had found a length of rope and had tied it to a sturdy saloon post, with the other end tied around his waist. He was moving through the treacherous currents, pulling people from the water, guiding them toward the handful of buildings that remained on higher ground. He moved without thought for his own safety, his focus absolute. He was not a Navajo warrior. He was not a fugitive. He was a savior. Deputy Hale was there too, but he was not in the water. He stood on the porch of the sheriff's office with a half-dozen of his posse members, all of them armed, all of them dry. He was not directing a rescue. He was watching, his eyes scanning the chaos with a predatory intensity. He was not looking for survivors. He was hunting. The miner, Peters, lost his grip on the slippery roof. He and his wife managed to cling to a floating timber, but their baby, wrapped in a blanket, slipped from his mother's arms and was swept away by the current. A collective cry of horror went up from those watching. The small bundle was moving fast, heading for the maelstrom where the levee had broken. No one moved. The current was too fast, the debris too thick. It was a death sentence to go in after the child. No one but Ashki. He did not hesitate. He untied the rope from his waist and plunged into the main current. He was a powerful swimmer, but the flood was stronger. It tossed him about, pulling him under. He surfaced, gasping, his eyes fixed on the small bundle of blankets. He was closing the distance, but it was agonizingly slow. He was tiring, his movements becoming more labored. Claire watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, her knuckles white. The turquoise amulet Ashki had given her dangled from her wrist. As she gripped the doorframe for support, the stone scraped hard against the wood, leaving a deep scratch in its smooth surface. The price, they were all paying it. From his vantage point on the porch, Sheriff Calder watched, his face ashen. He saw the selflessness, the impossible courage of the man he was supposed to be hunting. He saw the very definition of justice, and it had nothing to do with a badge or a law book. Ashki reached the baby. He grabbed the bundle and managed to hold it above the water, but the effort cost him dearly. The current slammed him against a piece of a broken wagon, and he went under again. He came up sputtering, but he was losing the fight. Then Hale made his move. He and his men charged into the shallower water, not toward the struggling child, but toward Ashki. "He is trying to get away," Hale roared, his voice carrying over the storm. "He is using the flood to escape. Do not let him go." A few men from the town, their minds clouded by panic and Hale's authoritative voice, joined them, splashing through the water, their faces set with grim purpose. They saw not a rescuer, but a fugitive. Ashki, battered and exhausted, finally fought his way to the relative shallows, the baby still held high in his arms. He stumbled toward the bank where the child's parents were weeping with a mixture of terror and hope. He was on his knees, his head bowed, his strength utterly spent, when he handed the child to its father. At that moment, Hale and his men surrounded him. "You are under arrest, Nez," Hale said, his voice triumphant, "for murder, robbery, and treason." The miner, Peters, the baby's father, looked from his rescued child to the armed men surrounding his savior, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning shame. But he said nothing. He was afraid. Ashki did not resist. He had nothing left to give. They hauled him to his feet, bound his hands behind his back, and dragged him through the mud toward the jail. The crowd parted, their faces a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and a terrible, silent complicity. They had just watched a man perform a miracle, and now they were watching him being led away in chains. Claire could only watch from the church doorway, her heart a cold, dead stone in her chest. The rain began to slacken, the worst of the storm having passed. In the eerie quiet that followed, she saw Sheriff Calder walk slowly to the jail. He did not look at Hale. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the ground, like a man who had just witnessed the death of his own soul. Hours later, as a watery moon shone down on the devastated town, Claire sat in the dark, silent church, the last of the children having been claimed by their parents. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the gurgle of the receding flood. The door creaked open. It was Sheriff Calder. He looked 10 years older, his face a gray mask of defeat. He walked over to her and sat down heavily in the pew. He did not say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, his hand emerging with a single, heavy iron key. He pressed it into her hand, his fingers cold and trembling. His eyes met hers, and in their weary depths, she saw not defeat, but a flicker of defiance. It was a silent confession, an act of rebellion, a final, desperate choice between the law and justice. The light of justice in the man who held the law had been lit, and he had just handed her the flame. The iron key was a cold, heavy promise in Claire's hand. In the gloom of the storm-ravaged church, she and Sheriff Calder laid out a plan born of desperation and a shared, newfound resolve. There was no justice to be found in San Miguel. The town, the law, the truth itself were all Ketchum's property. Their only hope was to seize his most valuable asset, the proof of his crimes, and take it to a higher authority, and that proof was on the midnight train. The clock was a merciless tyrant. They had less than 3 hours. "I can get a message to Ada," Calder said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "There is a young Dine man, a tracker, who sometimes brings venison into town. He trusts me. He will get a message to the camp." "What kind of message?" Claire asked, her mind already racing, calculating angles and timing, thinking like a photographer composing a difficult shot. "A diversion," Calder answered. "A big one. On the east side of town, away from the tracks, a fire, a scare. Anything to draw Hale and his pack of hyenas away from the jail for 20 minutes. That is all we will need." While Calder slipped out into the muddy darkness to find his messenger, Claire gathered her meager supplies, the satchel with her chemicals, a small, tightly corked bottle of collodion, another of silver nitrate, a flask of developer, and the single, precious glass plate, now wrapped in every piece of soft cloth she owned. She added the charred ledger, its smoky smell a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. It was a paltry arsenal to bring against a man like Ketchum. An hour later, Calder returned. "The message is sent," he said. "They will be ready." From the church, they had a clear view of the town. San Miguel was a wounded animal, licking its wounds in the pale moonlight. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a thick blanket of stinking brown mud. A few lanterns moved about, signs of people trying to salvage what little they had left. The sheriff's office, where Ashki was being held, was dark and quiet. Hale, confident in his victory, had likely retired to the saloon to celebrate. The diversion, when it came, was startling in its ferocity. A brilliant orange flame suddenly blossomed on the eastern ridge, a massive bonfire that lit up the night sky. It was followed by a series of piercing, ululating cries that echoed through the canyons, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. To the guilt-ridden and superstitious townsfolk, it must have sounded like the mountain spirits themselves had come to pass judgment. It was the signal, just as they had hoped. The saloon doors flew open and Deputy Hale emerged, followed by a dozen armed men. They stared at the fire, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. "It is them!" Hale shouted, his voice carrying on the still night air. "They are attacking! Mount up!" The posse, a disorganized and agitated mob, scrambled for their horses and thundered off toward the fire, a fool's chase after a ghost. Now Calder said. They moved quickly through the back alleys, their boots making sucking sounds in the deep mud. The town was deserted, all eyes drawn to the spectacle on the ridge. The jail was a small, solid building behind the main office. A single guard, a young man with a slack jaw, sat on a chair by the door, his rifle across his lap, his attention fixed on the distant fire. Calder approached him from the shadows. "You see that, son," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "That is a war party. Deputy Hale needs every man with a gun. You are to report to him immediately." The young guard, flustered by the sheriff's sudden appearance and command, scrambled to his feet. "Yes, sir. Sheriff, right away, sir." He ran off into the darkness without a backward glance. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. Claire's heart was a frantic bird in her chest. The cell was a small, dark cage. Ashki rose from the cot as she entered, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. He was bruised and battered from the flood, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He looked at her, then at Calder, who stood behind her, and a silent understanding passed between them. There were no words of thanks, no time for relief. There was only the mission. Calder handed him a knife. "I cannot give you a gun, not yet." Ashki took it, his fingers closing around the hilt. "It is enough." They made their way to the railroad tracks just south of town, at a long, gentle curve where the train would have to slow its pace before gathering speed for the open plains. They lay flat in a muddy ditch, the cold, wet earth seeping into their clothes, and they waited. They heard it before they saw it, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground, a rhythmic, pulsing heartbeat of iron and steam. Then its single, bright eye cut through the darkness, and the ground began to shake. The locomotive loomed, a monstrous black beast breathing smoke and fire, its massive wheels churning, pistons driving with relentless power. "The mail car is the third one back," Calder yelled over the deafening noise. It seemed to be moving impossibly fast. Claire's courage faltered. It could not be done. Ashki was already on his feet, running alongside the train, his strides long and powerful. He matched its speed, his body a fluid line of motion. He reached for a handhold on the side of the mail car, his fingers finding purchase, and in one incredible surge of strength, he swung himself up and onto the narrow iron ladder. He turned, bracing himself against the lurching car, and reached down a hand for Claire. "Now," he commanded. She ran, her lungs on fire, the mud trying to pull her down. The side of the train was a terrifying, rushing blur. She leaped, her hand finding his grip crushing, and he hauled her up out of the darkness and into the violent, roaring wind of the train's passage. For a moment, she clung to the ladder, her face pressed against the cold steel, her body trembling, deafened and blinded. Calder was next. He was older, heavier, but he was a man of surprising strength. With Ashki pulling from above and Claire guiding him from below, he made it, collapsing onto the small platform between the cars, his chest heaving. The door to the mail car was locked from the inside. Ashki did not hesitate. He used the butt of the knife Calder had given him, striking the edge of the door near the lock with a series of short, sharp, perfectly placed blows. The wood splintered. He put his shoulder to it, and the door burst inward. They tumbled inside, into the swaying, rattling confines of the car. It was lit by a single, swaying oil lamp. Sacks of mail were piled high, along with various crates and parcels. And in the center of the car, bolted to the floor, was a heavy iron safe, Ketchum's ledgers. But they had no time for the safe. Their goal was not to steal the books, but to make their own evidence undeniable. "There," Claire said, pointing to a small, clear space on the floor. She took out her precious cargo, the glass plate, the bottles of chemicals. It was a makeshift darkroom lurching and swaying at 50 miles an hour. "You need to block all the light," she told the men. "There are 2 windows." Ashki and Calder used mail sacks and heavy canvas tarps, stuffing them into the window frames, plunging the car into an almost absolute darkness. The only light was the single oil lamp, which Claire carefully placed on a high crate at the far end of the car. She worked with a surgeon's focus, her fear replaced by the familiar, comforting rhythm of her craft. She positioned the glass plate in a small, makeshift holder she fashioned from 2 pieces of wood. She placed the lamp behind it, then took a simple magnifying lens from her satchel. It was a crude, desperate setup, a bastardized version of a magic lantern. "Hold this," she said to Ashki, handing him a large, flat piece of white cardboard she had found among the packing materials. "Stand over there." She adjusted the lens, her hands steady despite the train's violent motion. A blurry, inverted image appeared on the cardboard. She moved the lens back and forth. Her brow furrowed in concentration, the image sharpened. And there it was, projected onto the cardboard, an image a foot high, swaying with the rhythm of the train, the chaotic scene of the ambush, and in the corner, the kneeling figure, the bandana, the crossed pickaxe and shovel of the San Miguel Mining Company. "The man's face," Calder said, his voice a tight whisper. "I know that face. That is Jedediah Sykes. He is Ketchum's right hand." It was clearer, more damning than they could have hoped for. But their triumph was short-lived. The door at the front of the car was thrown open. Deputy Hale stood there, his face a mask of rage, a pistol in his hand. "I should have known," he snarled. "When that fire started, I knew it was a trick." He had not fallen for the diversion completely. He had sent the posse ahead and had circled back, just in case. He had found the empty jail cell, seen the tracks in the mud leading to the railroad. "It is over," he said. "Give me the plate." He took a step into the car, and in that moment, the roof above him erupted inward. Ashki had moved with the speed of a striking snake. He had climbed the mail sacks and kicked his way through the roof of the car. He dropped down behind Hale, silent as a panther. Before the deputy could turn, Ashki had him, one arm around his throat, the other twisting the gun from his hand. The fight was brief and brutal in the confined space. Hale was strong and desperate, but Ashki was a warrior. They crashed against the mail sacks, their grunts and the thud of their bodies a counterpoint to the relentless rhythm of the wheels on the track. Ashki did not try to harm him, only to subdue him. He disarmed him, pinned him, his knee on the deputy's chest. On the roof, Calder appeared, his own gun now in his hand, pointed down at the struggling men. He had climbed over the top of the car. He had Hale's men, who had followed their boss, pinned down on the car ahead. "It is done. Hale," Calder said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. And then Calder's eyes fell on a piece of equipment bolted to the wall near the door, something they had not noticed in their haste. It was a telegraph key. He looked at Claire, then at the projected image, then at the telegraph. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "Get him off the key," he said to Ashki. Calder sat down at the small telegraph station. The train was carrying the U.S. mail. It had a direct line to the world. He began to tap out a message. The sharp, staccato clicks a sudden, urgent voice in the swaying car. "To U.S. Marshal Prescott, Arizona Territory. Stop. Nathan Ketchum and Deputy Sheriff Hale of San Miguel, implicated in federal mail robbery and murder. Stop. Possess photographic proof and company ledgers. Stop. Proceeding eastbound on Midnight Express. Stop. Request immediate assistance at next junction. Stop. Sheriff Tom Calder, San Miguel. End." He finished and looked up. The first pale hint of dawn was visible through the hole Ashki had made in the roof. The light of the rising sun was beginning to chase the darkness from the sky. The truth was no longer a secret whispered in the dark. It was a message, flying on a wire at the speed of light, and it could not be unheard. Their weapon was no longer just a piece of glass. It was a matter of official record. The telegraph key fell silent, its last click echoing in the swaying car like a final, irrevocable judgment. Outside, the world was changing from black to a deep, bruised purple. The dawn was coming. The relentless, hammering rhythm of the wheels on the track was the only sound, a frantic heartbeat counting down their remaining time. They were hurtling toward a future they could not predict, armed with nothing but a fragile piece of glass and a message sent on a wire. Suddenly, the train's rhythm broke. A piercing shriek of metal on metal filled the air, a sound of pure mechanical agony. The floor lurched violently, throwing them against the walls of the car. Mail sacks toppled, and the heavy iron safe groaned on its bolts. The train was braking, hard and fast. Claire grabbed for a handhold, her knuckles white, as their momentum tried to tear her from her feet. The screeching went on for an impossibly long time before they shuddered to a final, jarring halt. The silence that followed was profound, unnatural. The train had stopped in the middle of a newly constructed iron bridge that spanned a wide, deep gorge. Far below, the river, swollen and brown from the recent storm, churned and eddied. The first rays of the rising sun struck the high steel trusses of the bridge, making them gleam like the bones of some great, skeletal beast. Ahead, on the tracks, stood a barricade of railroad ties and mining timbers, and in front of it stood Nathan Ketchum. He was not alone. A dozen of his most loyal men, miners and security guards, stood with him, rifles held at the ready. Ketchum himself held no rifle. In his hand was a small black box with a plunger on top, a detonator. Wires ran from it to several canvas-wrapped packages tucked into the steel support structure of the bridge. Calder peered through the hole in the roof, his face grim. He has rigged the bridge. Ashki moved to the open doorway, his body a tense coil of readiness. Hale, a bound and gagged prisoner, watched from the floor with wide, terrified eyes. "The game is up," Ketchum's voice boomed, amplified by the strange acoustics of the gorge. He was a master of the stage, and this was his grand finale. "You have been very clever, Sheriff, but you are too late. This bridge is a symbol of progress. Its destruction, along with this train, will be seen as a barbaric act of terror, a tragic, final spasm of resistance from a dying people." He gestured vaguely toward Ashki. "I will be a hero, the man who tried to stop them, the man who will rebuild." He was insane. He would sacrifice the train, his men, everything to preserve his lie. In that moment, as Ketchum postured and gloated, Claire saw her chance. The sun was just clearing the eastern canyon rim, its light clean and sharp. It was the lantern she had prayed for. "Ashki," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The cardboard, hold it up." He understood instantly. He grabbed the large white sheet and held it in the open doorway, creating a makeshift screen. Claire moved behind him, her hands steady. The lens and the precious glass plate held in perfect alignment. The brilliant, horizontal rays of the rising sun passed through the lens, through the image etched on the glass, and found their focus on the screen. The image was huge, bright, and impossibly clear. It shimmered in the morning air, a ghost made of light, the kneeling attacker, the bandana, the face of Jedediah Sykes, the crossed pickaxe and shovel of the mining company. It was a silent, unassailable accusation. The miners on the bridge with Ketchum saw it. A murmur of confusion and disbelief rippled through their ranks. They knew Sykes. They saw him every day. They knew the company logo. They looked from the impossible image to the furious face of their employer. "He lied to you," Claire shouted, her voice carrying across the abyss, clear and strong. "He paid them. It is all in his ledgers. He staged the ambush to steal the land his mind stands on. He is the savage." Ketchum's face contorted with rage. "It is a trick, a phantom. Kill them." But his men hesitated. The seed of doubt had been planted. Then, a single man stepped forward from the line of riflemen. It was Peters, the miner whose baby Ashki had saved from the flood. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he lowered his rifle. "She is telling the truth," he said, his voice cracking with shame. "It was Sykes. I saw him. Ketchum paid us. He paid us all to keep quiet. He gave us a bonus to join the posse. He said it was for show. I did not know. I did not know he would kill anyone." The confession broke the dam. Two more men lowered their rifles, their faces a mixture of fear and relief. The foundation of Ketchum's power, built on a bedrock of lies and intimidation, was crumbling before his eyes. Seeing his authority evaporate, Hale made his move. With a desperate roar, he launched himself at Ashki, trying to knock him and the projected image off the train. The two men crashed to the floor of the car, a tangle of limbs. Calder fired a warning shot over the heads of the men on the bridge, forcing them back. The fight between Ashki and Hale was a raw, brutal explosion of violence. They spilled out of the car and onto the narrow coupling platform, then scrambled up the ladder to the roof of the car. They traded blows, slipping and sliding on the dew-slicked metal, high above the churning river. It was a fight not of skill, but of pure, desperate rage. Hale, seeing his future turning to dust, fought like a cornered animal. He lunged, missed his footing, and his scream was one of pure terror as he slid over the edge of the roof. He managed to grab hold of the rain gutter with both hands, his body dangling over the precipice. His feet kicked at empty air. His grip began to slip. Ashki stood over him, his chest heaving, his face bruised and bloody. He could have watched him fall. He could have stepped on his fingers. It would have been easy. It would have been, some might say, justice. Instead, he knelt down, reached over the edge, and grabbed Hale by the collar of his shirt. He held him there, the man's life literally in his hands. He would not kill. He would not become the thing he was fighting against. Down on the tracks, Ketchum saw it all, his plan, his men, his future, all gone. He let out a primal scream of pure, undiluted hatred. He looked at the detonator in his hand. If he was going down, he would take them all with him. He raised the plunger, his thumb pressing down. In the split second before he could complete the action, something flashed in the sunlight. A glint of steel. Ashki, holding Hale with one hand, had seen the thin copper wires running from the detonator to the charges on the bridge. With his free hand, he drew his knife and threw it with a flick of his wrist. The blade spun, a perfect silver arc, and sliced cleanly through the two wires. Ketchum slammed the plunger down. Nothing happened. A dead, metallic click. He stared at the useless box in his hand, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. It was the opening Calder needed. The sheriff stood at the front of the mail car, his stance solid, his aim steady. He fired once. The shot was not aimed to kill. The bullet struck Ketchum squarely in the right hand. The detonator flew from his grasp, tumbling end over end through the air before splashing into the muddy river far below. Ketchum stared at his shattered hand, a cry of pain and disbelief escaping his lips. It was over. The last of his loyal men threw down their weapons. The confrontation on the bridge had ended not with a massive explosion, but with a severed wire, a single, precise shot, and an act of mercy. Ashki pulled a whimpering, defeated Hale back onto the roof of the train. The sun was fully above the horizon now, bathing the entire scene in a clean, honest light. The bridge stood, a symbol not of a progress that destroyed, but of a connection that could be saved. The truth, held high in the morning sun, had not just been seen, it had been accepted, and with that acceptance, the reign of Nathan Ketchum was finally, completely broken. The journey back to San Miguel was a slow, funereal procession. The train, now under Sheriff Calder's command, pushed the barricade off the tracks and limped backward, its engine hissing like a wounded animal. In the mail car, Nathan Ketchum sat slumped against the wall, his shattered hand crudely bandaged, his eyes vacant with a disbelief so profound it looked like madness. Deputy Hale was a broken man, weeping silent, bitter tears of shame and self-pity. The miners who had stood with Ketchum were now their disarmed and sullen prisoners, their faces a mixture of guilt and a dawning, terrifying comprehension of how thoroughly they had been duped. When the train finally arrived at the San Miguel depot, the sun was high in a sky that had been washed clean by the storm. The air was fresh and cool, and the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Nearly the entire town was there. They had seen the train stop on the bridge, had heard the distant gunshots, and had waited in a state of tense, anxious ignorance. Their faces were a sea of questions as Calder, Ashki, and Claire emerged, followed by the prisoners. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. The sight of Ketchum, the town's architect and tyrant, now a wounded, defeated captive, was too shocking to process. The sight of Ashki, the hunted fugitive, walking free and unbound, was equally stunning. The truth of what had happened on the bridge passed through the crowd not as a story, but as a palpable, undeniable feeling. Calder, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep, did not make a speech. He simply marched his prisoners to the jail and locked them in the cells. He posted Peters and two of the other miners who had turned against Ketchum as guards, a quiet but powerful statement of trust and shared responsibility. The days that followed were a strange, unsettled time. The red dust was gone, washed away by the flood, and with it, the fever of hatred and suspicion seemed to have broken. The townspeople went about the work of rebuilding, but they did so with a quiet, introspective air. They had looked into the abyss of their own prejudice and had been saved by the very people they had condemned. It was a difficult, humbling lesson. The official word came 3 days later. A telegraph boy ran from the station, waving the flimsy yellow paper. He handed it to Calder, who read it aloud on the porch of his office, his voice steady and clear for all to hear. The message from the United States Marshal's office in Prescott was unequivocal. Federal marshals were en route. All assets of the San Miguel Mining Company were to be seized pending a full investigation. The rule of law, the real law, was finally coming to San Miguel. That evening, the town held a meeting in the half-repaired, mud-stained church. It was not an official proceeding, but a gathering of souls who needed to decide what kind of people they wanted to be. Ada and a delegation of Dine elders were there, seated in the front pew, a silent, dignified presence that commanded more respect than Ketchum's money ever had. There were arguments, old fears and prejudices died hard, but the testimony of Peters and the other miners, their voices choked with shame as they confessed their role in Ketchum's schemes, was a powerful solvent. When Sheriff Calder unrolled the charred but legible company ledger, detailing the payments for the ambush, the last vestiges of dissent crumbled. In the end, they voted. They voted to petition the territorial government and the railroad company to honor the original treaties. They voted to declare the foothills of Cebitai a protected area, off-limits to any mining or development. The railroad, facing a federal investigation and the unified opposition of a community it could no longer bully, would have to find a new route around the sacred land. The next morning, Claire reopened the schoolhouse. The room was clean, the mud swept away, and the air smelled of pine soap and fresh hope. On the main wall, where a faded map of the United States had once hung, she tacked up a new photograph. It was a print she had painstakingly made in her small room, using the rising sun as her enlarger. It was the image from the bridge, a picture of stark contrasts, the black iron of the man-made structure against the soft, glowing light of the dawn. She called it Iron Bridge at Dawn. It was not just a picture. It was a testament, a reminder of the moment when the truth had become too big to ignore. As she was stepping back to admire her work, Ashki entered. He walked to the camp of his people, a place he had not seen since the day of the flood. Ada met him at the edge of the canyon. He stood before her, not as a warrior, but as a grandson. He took the scratched turquoise amulet from his wrist, the one he had loaned to Claire, the one that had seen them through the darkness, and handed it back to her. It was a piece of their past, a symbol of a duty fulfilled. He had protected the land, and now he was returning its guardian spirit to its keeper. Ada took the old stone in her wrinkled hands. Then, from a pouch at her belt, she produced another piece of turquoise. It was smaller, a brighter, clearer blue, like the morning sky after a storm. She gave it to him, and he tied it to a new leather cord, placing it around his neck. It was not a replacement. It was an addition, a new path, running alongside the old one. He had honored the past, and now he was free to walk toward a future. He came to the schoolhouse, the new stone a brilliant spot of color against his dark shirt. He looked at the photograph on the wall for a long time. "It is a good picture," he said. "It tells a true story." "It tells our story," she corrected him softly. They stood together in the quiet schoolroom, the space between them no longer filled with the frantic energy of survival, but with a deep, comfortable silence. The conflict that had thrown them together was over, but the bond it had forged remained, stronger than steel. Calder had found his honor, not by enforcing a broken law, but by upholding a higher justice. Ashki, the solitary guardian, had become a bridge between his people and the town. And Claire, the detached observer, had found her voice, her purpose, and her home. A week later, the mail brought a letter for her. It was from the editor of a prestigious Santa Fe gazette. He had seen some of her earlier photographs, the ones documenting the raw life of the territory. He was offering her a commission, a chance to travel, to photograph the changing West, to have her work displayed in a gallery. It was everything she had ever dreamed of before coming to San Miguel. She stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, the letter in her hand, her heart a confusing mix of excitement and a strange, deep reluctance. She looked out at the town, at the new timbers rising from the mud, at the children playing in the street, at the distant, sacred peaks of Cebitai. This place was a part of her now. To leave it would feel like a kind of amputation. Ashki came and stood beside her. He did not ask what was in the letter. He seemed to already know. Santa Fe is a long walk, he said, his eyes on the horizon. I know, she whispered, the conflict warring within her. He was silent for a moment, watching a hawk circle in the wide blue sky. I will walk with you for a part of the way, he said finally, and then I will come back. The land needs a guardian. She turned to look at him, and in his calm, steady gaze, she found her answer. Love was not a cage that held you in one place. It was not a reward you received at the end of a story. It was the quiet, unwavering strength that gave you the courage to choose your own path, and the reason to come home. The future was unwritten, a vast, open territory, but they would walk into it together, each on their own path, but always side by side. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so our stories can reach more ears.